You don't deserve to be here, David. This is my day, not yours. My sister's voice cut across the room like a whip, echoing off the chandelier-lit walls of the banquet hall where her wedding rehearsal dinner was being held. And the sound of cutlery clinking against glass froze as dozens of relatives and family friends turned their heads toward me, some smirking, some whispering behind their napkins, while others just looked away uncomfortably, pretending they hadn't heard her humiliation land squarely on my chest. I felt their eyes measure me, strip me, judge me, as if in that single moment my years of sacrifice, my relentless climb from nothing into a life I had built with my own blood and sweat, had been erased by the cruelty of a younger sister who had once leaned on me for every dollar of her education and every bill that kept her in a safe apartment, but who now, with her perfectly curled hair and diamond ring catching the light, wanted me exiled from the very celebration I had indirectly funded. And I forced myself to stand still, jaw tight, eyes calm, even though a storm roared inside me. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is David Carter. I'm 39 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. And if you're wondering how a man who had fought his way through poverty, through nights of ramen noodles and cheap gas station coffee, through jobs that broke my back and bosses who broke my pride, could now be standing in a luxury hotel ballroom dressed in a tailored navy suit, and yet still be treated like the outsider in his own bloodlines gathering. Well, that's the paradox of my life, and it's the reason I'm telling you this story. Because there's one thing they didn't know, one quiet advantage I'd been carrying with me all these years, like a knife hidden beneath the coat of a man everyone thinks is unarmed, and I'll tell you right now, I never pull it out unless I'm left with no choice. The air smelled of buttered rolls and white wine. The string quartet had gone silent mid-song, and I could still hear Aunt Lydia whispering too loudly to the man beside her. He shouldn't even be here. She's right. And it was then I remembered the fountain pen, a simple black and gold Mont Blanc I had given my sister on the day she graduated college. Engraved with her initials, the one she'd once said she'd use to sign her first job contract and one day her marriage license. It had been my way of saying, "You earned this," but I believed in you first. And as I caught a glimmer of it tucked in her clutch purse by her chair, I realized she hadn't thrown away my gift. She hadn't forgotten what I'd done for her. She just wanted to erase me publicly, to turn me into a ghost in front of the people who should have known better, and in that moment I let my mind drift back to the years that brought us here. Because humiliation like this doesn't come out of nowhere. It brews, it festers, and it's always fueled by debts people are too proud to acknowledge. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. My mother looked down into her lap, and I knew, as I had known for years, that they would not stand up for me. They had their own reasons, twisted and small, for siding with the daughter who offered them adoration over the son who had offered them stability, and while they might pretend neutrality, silence is just another way of holding the knife steady while someone else drives it in. So I stayed still, staring at my sister's smiling fiancé, a corporate lawyer with an expensive watch and the smug look of a man who thought marrying into my family gave him the higher ground, and I let the sting of her words burn into me, because the longer it burned, the sharper I felt myself becoming, the calmer, the colder, until I realized she thought she had humiliated me. But really, she had just awakened the part of me that no one in that room had ever seen, the part that remembers debts, not for the money, but for the betrayal behind them. And as the clapping started, yes, unbelievably clapping, as some cousins cheered her boldness and others laughed nervously, filling the silence with the kind of fake approval that's meant to patch over discomfort, I nodded slightly as if to say, "All right, you've made your move. Now it's my turn." I remember the first time my sister, Emily, called me from her college dorm in tears, her voice cracking through a cheap prepaid phone, telling me she was afraid she wouldn't be able to stay in school because her scholarship only covered tuition, not the endless stream of fees, books, lab costs, and rent that piled up like bricks around her chest, and I told her not to worry, that I'd handle it. Even though, at that time, I was still eating canned beans in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Columbus and driving a rusted Ford Taurus that coughed smoke every time I turned the key. But I took on an extra consulting project, worked weekends, and mailed her the money before she even asked again, because that's what I believe family was for. Because when our parents shrugged and said they couldn't help, Dad too stubborn and prideful to admit he'd mismanaged every dollar he'd earned, Mom too wrapped up in appearances to cut back on her own little luxuries, I figured it was on me, the older brother, to step up, to make sure she had what I never did, a chance to walk across a graduation stage without debt crushing her ankles. And in those years, when my nights blurred into spreadsheets and client calls, when my only luxury was a black coffee from the gas station across the street, I carried her like she was part of me, and I never complained, not once, because the sound of her gratitude in those phone calls, the way she told me she was proud of me, that I was her role model, that was worth more than the checks I sent. I still see her freshman apartment in my mind. The peeling linoleum, the smell of instant noodles, the tiny window that looked out over a parking lot, and the way she hugged me when I drove 6 hours on a Friday night just to drop off groceries, because she said she was tired of surviving on cafeteria food. How she whispered, "One day I'll pay you back." And I laughed, told her it wasn't about money, that all I wanted was to see her succeed. But maybe I should have listened more closely to the way she said it, the guilt in her voice, because guilt can ferment into resentment if it sits too long unspoken. I put her through 4 years of college, then another 2 when she decided to pursue a master's degree, and I paid her rent when she moved into a bigger place, a nicer one, because she said her old neighborhood made her feel unsafe, and I wanted her to have the comfort I never had. So I wrote the checks, wired the funds, told myself it was temporary, that one day she'd be standing at the altar and I'd be there, proud, the brother who had carried her across the finish line. But life doesn't repay debts with gratitude. It finds ways to twist the knife. I remember the night she got her first job, how she called me giddy, telling me she'd used that Mont Blanc pen I'd given her to sign the offer letter, and I'd smiled so wide my cheeks hurt, sitting alone in my apartment with a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving for good news, pouring myself a glass, raising it to no one but the shadows, thinking, this is what it's all for. And yet, as the years rolled by and she started climbing her own ladder, she called less, visited less, until our relationship was mostly holiday dinners and the occasional birthday card. And I told myself that was fine, that distance was natural. But I noticed how she always seemed colder when her fiancé was around, how he looked at me like I was competition instead of blood, and how she let him set the tone. Let him turn her gratitude into silence, until it was as if my role in her life had been erased, rewritten as though she had carried herself alone. When she announced her engagement, she didn't even tell me first. I found out from Mom, who said it in passing over the phone, like it was just another piece of family gossip, and when I asked Emily about it, she said she had meant to call, that she'd been busy, that I shouldn't take it personally, but something in her tone told me I already wasn't part of the picture, that my years of sacrifice were being edited out of the story she told about herself. Then came the real sting, the invitation that never arrived. Everyone else got theirs. Cousins, aunts, uncles, friends from her sorority, even neighbors who barely knew her. But I didn't, and when I asked, trying to mask the hurt in my voice, she told me the guest list was limited, that they wanted to avoid drama, and I understood then that she meant me, that I had somehow become the drama after carrying her for years. And though she never said it outright, I could hear the hidden motive beneath her excuse. She wanted to stand tall without my shadow, to erase the evidence that her success had been built on my back. And what better way to humiliate me than to cut me out publicly, to make sure the story of her wedding didn't include the brother who had bankrolled her education. The worst part wasn't her, though. It was the way the rest of the family justified it, the way they whispered that maybe it was for the best, that maybe I was too serious, too intense, that maybe I'd make a scene as if my very presence was a threat to her happiness. And I realized that what hurt most wasn't the snub itself, but the chorus of silent approval. The way people I'd bailed out, people I'd lent money to when their cars broke down, people I'd hosted in my home when they were in trouble, could now nod along with my erasure, as though my existence had always been optional. That's when something in me began to shift, slowly, quietly, like ice forming over a river. I stopped looking for gratitude, stopped expecting fairness, and started seeing every smile, every excuse, every justification as part of the same betrayal, one I would not forgive lightly. Because the truth is, I've always kept records, maybe not on paper, but in my mind, who owes me, who betrayed me, who stood by me, and though I never planned on cashing those records in, I realized then that one day, when the time was right, I would. So there I was, still standing in that ballroom, like a man who'd been invited into a house only to be told he was unwelcome once he stepped through the door, and the chatter that resumed after my sister's outburst wasn't the same as before. It had a different texture now, slick and sharp, as though every word carried an undercurrent of judgment directed at me. And though people pretended to move on, toasting, laughing, turning back to their plates of chicken marsala and roasted vegetables. I could feel the divide like a wall pressing in on my chest. And when I finally sat down, my mother leaned over and whispered that I should understand. That Emily was under a lot of pressure and didn't mean anything by it, and that it would be better if I kept a low profile tonight, as if I hadn't already been made invisible in front of 100 pairs of eyes. And I bit back the urge to laugh because it was so perfectly predictable, her ability to justify whatever cruelty Emily threw my way. Dad just kept his face stoic, stabbing at his food, refusing to look at me, which was his way of siding with whoever made the most noise. And in that silence I realized I was completely alone in this family, not because I had abandoned them, but because I had outgrown the story they wanted to tell about themselves. A story where my sacrifices didn't exist, where Emily's success was hers alone, where I was the odd man out. Useful when checks needed writing, expendable once the debt had been erased from memory. When the toasts began, one by one, relatives stood to tell stories about Emily. How proud they were, how radiant she looked, how lucky she was to have found a man like Jason. And not a single one mentioned the brother who had been the scaffolding for her entire future. And I noticed with cold amusement how she soaked in their praise, nodding, smiling, holding Jason's hand. All while that Montblanc pen sat in her clutch, gleaming under the dim light, a silent artifact of the truth she wanted buried. By the time her best friend stood and said, "Emily, you've always been the most independent, the most determined person I know," I nearly choked on the irony, and for a second I thought of telling them the truth, of laying bare every dollar, every sleepless night, every time I sacrificed so she could stand here today. But then I caught Emily's eyes across the room, sharp and daring, as if she wanted me to break, to lose control, to validate her exclusion, and something in me hardened. No, I wouldn't give her that satisfaction, not tonight. Instead, I excused myself quietly, stepping out into the hotel's courtyard where the night air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of magnolias, and I stared up at the Ohio sky, hazy with city light, remembering a time when I believed family was unbreakable, that no matter the conflicts or jealousies, blood was thicker than water. But standing there in the chill, I realized blood only matters when people want something from you, and when you have nothing left to give, they'll toss you aside as if you never mattered. A group of cousins followed me out, not to comfort me, but to say, with awkward half-smiles, that I shouldn't take it personally, that weddings are complicated, that Emily just wanted things to be smooth. And though their words were meant to soothe, they felt like acid, because what they were really saying was, it's easier if you're erased. One cousin even chuckled and said, "At least you saved a ton of money not having to bring a gift," as if mocking the years I had already given. And I saw then how deep the rot went. How my family had normalized my sacrifice but recoiled from my presence, because my very existence reminded them of debts unpaid, of truths they preferred hidden, and that's when a strange calm came over me. I walked back inside, watched Emily and Jason swaying on the dance floor during a rehearsal spin, surrounded by clapping hands and smiling faces, and I knew, this wasn't the end of my story, this was the beginning, because humiliation is fuel when you know how to burn it slow. I let their laughter wash over me, let the sting fade into steel, and I promised myself I would not lash out tonight, not tomorrow, not until the right moment, because revenge isn't about shouting the truth into a room that won't listen. It's about building a moment so undeniable that when it comes, they can't look away, and that's exactly what I intended to do. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I drove back to my house on the outskirts of Columbus, a modest but carefully chosen brick home with maple trees that framed the driveway. The kind of house I had bought not for show, but for stability, for the comfort of finally having a place that couldn't be taken from me. And yet, as I pulled in, the silence inside felt heavier than usual. Like even the walls knew I had been humiliated, and though I poured myself a black coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the faint scratches in the wood from years of use, the echo of Emily's words, "You don't deserve to be here," replayed in my head until it became less of a sting and more of a steady drumbeat, fueling something deeper inside me. I didn't show up at the wedding that weekend, not because I couldn't have, but because I knew the picture they wanted to paint. Emily radiant, Jason smug beside her, the family unified behind them, me erased, and I decided to give them that illusion, for now. In the weeks that followed, I heard bits and pieces from relatives. Some sent photos, others bragged about the ceremony, each message laced with the unspoken reminder that I had not been part of it. And when I ran into Mom at the grocery store one afternoon, she told me gently, You know, it was really better this way, less tension. As if her soothing tone could disguise the knife in the words, and I just nodded, letting her believe I had accepted my place on the outside. What they didn't know was that every dismissal, every smug retelling, every photograph waved in my face only deepened my patience. Because I wasn't broken, I was listening, watching, taking notes. I started asking subtle questions, not directly about Emily or Jason, but about the family, about finances, about little things I knew people liked to brag about when they thought no one was really paying attention. And slowly, patterns began to reveal themselves. My father boasting to an old friend at the diner about how Jason was talking to him about expanding opportunities. My aunt bragging that Emily had mentioned she might finally be in a position to give back to the family that had supported her, which nearly made me laugh out loud considering who had actually supported her. They thought they were tightening control, folding Jason into the family narrative while writing me out of it, but what they didn't realize was that every word they spoke in my presence was ammunition, and I knew how to catalog it. At work, my colleagues noticed I was quieter, more focused than usual, but I brushed it off as stress, when in reality I was sketching out a plan in the margins of my mind, a plan that would require patience and precision. To the outside world, I looked tired, maybe even defeated. I skipped a few social outings, let calls go unanswered, and when a cousin suggested over Facebook that maybe I should just let bygones be bygones and reconnect with Emily, I didn't reply, because silence was my greatest disguise. Let them think I was broken, licking my wounds, moving on. The truth was, I had already begun pulling threads they couldn't see, threads that would eventually unravel everything they were building. One evening, sitting alone with a glass of bourbon, I held that old receipt book I had kept from years ago, filled with scribbled notes of money I had lent, bills I had paid, a ledger of sacrifices, and though I had never planned to use it for anything, I realized now it was more than memory. It was leverage, because debts unacknowledged are still debts, and when you press on the right ones at the right time, people crumble. I thought about Emily's pen, the Mont Blanc she still carried, and I smiled at the irony. She could carry the symbol of my support into her new life, but she couldn't carry me, and that contradiction was going to be the first crack I widened. I started small, casually reaching out to extended relatives, asking them about their lives, listening more than I spoke, gathering details. Who was in debt, who had secrets, who trusted Jason a little too quickly, and while I offered no judgment, no opinion, I let them talk, because people reveal more when they think you're no threat. Meanwhile, Emily and Jason posted curated photos online, their smiles wide, their captions dripping with declarations of independence. And I let them because every performance eventually slips. What they didn't know was that by erasing me, they had given me the clearest view of all. The vantage point of the outsider, the one who sees every weakness they try to hide. And as I sipped my bourbon, the faint taste of oak and smoke coating my tongue, I whispered to myself the same phrase I had once whispered when I was broke and clawing my way upward. Patience is a weapon, and this time I was determined to wield it. It was about 2 months after the wedding when the first of them appeared, sliding into my life with the kind of timing that felt both coincidental and suspicious, and her name was Sarah, a former classmate of Emily's who I hadn't spoken to in years, but she reached out over Facebook with a warm message about how unfairly I'd been treated. How she had been at the wedding and thought the whole thing with me not being there was, honestly, just wrong. And at first it was disarming to hear someone acknowledge the injustice so plainly when everyone else around me kept gaslighting me into believing it was better this way. But something in the syrupy tone of her words made me pause, though I didn't show it. We agreed to meet for coffee at a little cafe on High Street, and she leaned forward across the table with that concerned expression people wear when they want to look compassionate, telling me I deserved better, that Emily had changed, that Jason was controlling, and I let her speak, nodding in the right places, sipping my black coffee while she carefully slipped in lines about how she knew the family was talking about redistributing responsibilities, how Jason wanted to invest in something bigger, and thought maybe I should clear the air before decisions were made. I didn't challenge her, didn't reveal that I knew far more about Jason's ambitions than she suspected, just listened, because the moment someone mixes empathy with subtle persuasion, you learn they're carrying someone else's agenda. She kept her smile warm, her hand brushing mine when she laughed, as though softening me was part of her assignment, and I walked away from that meeting knowing exactly what she was. A messenger dressed as a friend, her loyalty not to me but to the narrative Emily and Jason were building, and while her words might have swayed a man desperate for validation, To me, they were confirmation that my sister feared me enough to send emissaries. I played along, exchanged a few more texts, allowed her to think she had earned my trust because keeping her close meant keeping a direct line into their camp, and every slip of information was another thread I could tug when the time was right. Not long after, I crossed paths with Mike, though not in a cafe or through some carefully arranged approach. It was in the most mundane way possible, at the auto shop where I was getting my car serviced. The smell of oil and rubber, heavy in the air, the sound of tools clanging against metal, and he was leaning over the counter waiting for his truck to be finished. Mike had been a friend in high school, not close but steady, the kind of guy who didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. And after a few minutes of catching up, he asked bluntly, "So what the hell happened with your sister? People are talking like you don't exist." The directness startled me because no one else had been willing to put it that way, and when I told him the short version, his only response was a slow shake of his head and, "That's cold, man. Real cold." There was no performance in his tone, no subtle push to make me do anything, just a recognition of the truth, and in that plain acknowledgement, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, the sharp edge of someone who wasn't trying to manipulate me. Mike didn't offer flowery sympathy or promises of fixing anything. He just said, "If you need a hand with anything, you know where to find me." And that was it. No strings, no persuasion. Over the following weeks, he proved it in small ways. A call to check in, a ride when my car was in the shop, a six-pack left on my porch with a note that said, "Don't let the bastards get to you." He wasn't part of my plan yet, but he was becoming a fixture in my life, the kind of ally you don't recognize until you compare him to the Sarahs of the world, who pretend to offer support while they fish for information. The difference between Sarah and Mike wasn't immediate, but it revealed itself in the silences. Sarah always filled them with chatter, with nudges, with reminders of how strained things were between me and the family, while Mike let silence sit, unbothered, as if to say my pain didn't need to be dressed up in platitudes. And I found myself smiling at the irony. My sister thought she had surrounded herself with loyal people, but loyalty is easy to fake until it's tested, and I had every intention of testing it soon. For now, I let Sarah think she had my ear, and I let Mike remain in the background, steady and unassuming, while I sharpened the edge of my patience. Because if there's one thing I had learned through years of sacrifice, it's that people always reveal themselves eventually, and when they do, you only need to be ready to act. It was strange how quickly momentum shifted once I stopped flinching at the humiliation and started leaning into the silence, because the family's assumption was that I'd lick my wounds quietly and disappear into the background. But instead I kept moving, and the first small victory came in a way none of them expected. The scholarship fund. For years I had contributed quietly, funneling part of my income into a local program that paid for high school seniors to attend college, something no one in my family ever really noticed or cared to ask about. But that spring, one of the recipients I'd mentored stood on a stage at the Civic Center and called me out by name, thanking me publicly for the guidance and support that allowed her to be the first in her family to attend university. The applause that filled the room wasn't for Emily, it wasn't for Jason, it wasn't for anyone who had written me off as disposable. It was for me, and while I didn't bask in it, I absorbed it quietly, a reminder that my sacrifices weren't invisible to everyone. The local paper even ran a short piece with my photo, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt the scales tip slightly in my favor, like the world was acknowledging what my family had tried so hard to erase. Mike was there that night, clapping the loudest, grinning in that lopsided way of his, and when we grabbed burgers afterward, he raised a glass to me and said, "See? They can't rewrite the truth." It felt good, not because of the recognition, but because it planted doubt in the narrative Emily was building. If outsiders were seeing me as the steady, reliable one, then her attempts to paint me as irrelevant were already cracking. But victories have a way of attracting storms, and it wasn't long before the pushback arrived. A week later, Sarah showed up at my door, smile wide and voice dripping with urgency, telling me she'd heard the family was uncomfortable with me parading my generosity in public, that it made Emily look ungrateful, that Jason thought I was trying to steal the spotlight, and that if I really wanted reconciliation, I should keep things quieter, more private. I let her finish her rehearsed speech, nodded at the right places, but inside I felt the air shift. My small win had rattled them, otherwise they wouldn't have bothered sending someone to try to muzzle me. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already started gathering receipts, not literal ones yet, but connections, whispers, and patterns, and every word out of her mouth was another note for my ledger. Still, the sting of her message was real. It wasn't just about silencing me, it was about framing me as the aggressor, the one who made Emily feel pressured, flipping the narrative so I was the villain again. The real blow, though, came 2 nights later when I drove past my parents' house, the home I had been sending money toward for over a decade to help keep the mortgage afloat, and saw a group of cars parked out front, laughter spilling from the windows, the smell of barbecue drifting into the street. At first, I thought it was just a neighborhood gathering, but when I recognized the cars, aunts, uncles, cousins, it hit me. It was a family dinner, one I hadn't even been told about. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, watching shadows move across the curtains, listening to the muffled sound of people I had spent my life providing for, celebrating without me. And when the door opened briefly and Emily stepped out in a sundress, her arm looped casually through Jason's as they carried a tray of food, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the reminder that no matter how much I gave, they had decided I was expendable. Mike called later that night asking if I wanted to grab a drink, and though I almost said yes, I told him no. Not because I didn't want company, but because I needed the silence to crystallize the truth. The small win of recognition had been real, but so was the setback of exclusion, and the lesson was clear. My family wasn't just pushing me to the margins. They were actively rewriting the story of who I was, replacing me in gatherings, conversations, and memories. And if I wanted to reclaim my place, it wouldn't come from applause in a civic center, or a line in a newspaper. It would come from patience, precision, and timing. The night I sat in my car outside my parents' house, watching silhouettes laugh and move behind curtains, I had helped keep open with my money for years. Something inside me hardened, not with rage or bitterness, but with a chilling clarity that settled into my bones like ice. This was no longer about hurt feelings or invitations withheld. This was about erasure. About my family's conscious decision to write me out of their story while still quietly benefiting from the foundation I had laid beneath them. And if they were comfortable doing that, then they had forgotten one crucial fact. I knew where every thread of that foundation was tied, and I had the patience to unravel it stitch by stitch without ever raising my voice. That night I pulled out an old leather notebook I hadn't touched in years. The same one I used when mapping out my financial climb in my 20s. And on the first page I wrote 3 words in block letters: control, consequence, closure. Control would be the discipline to never let my emotions dictate a single move. Consequence would be the quiet, undeniable weight of my decisions landing where they needed to. Closure would be the endgame, the point where their rewriting of me collapsed under the weight of reality. The first step wasn't about money or exposure, it was about information. Families like mine thrived on whispers, half-truths, and manipulation, so I began gathering, listening, probing lightly when I had the chance. Sarah was the easiest mark, always eager to share updates under the guise of being the helpful mediator, and I let her think I was still pining for reconciliation as she spilled details about Emily's new in-laws, their debts, their investments, their petty dramas. I didn't push too hard. Just let her talk, nodding and occasionally offering a self-deprecating comment to keep her confident in my vulnerability. Every detail went into the notebook. Mike, on the other hand, became my sounding board, though not in the way he expected. I didn't tell him the depth of what I was planning, but I tested theories on him, floated hypothetical scenarios, asked questions about leverage and perception. He was a loyal friend, but also pragmatic, and he had a knack for cutting through emotional fog with blunt clarity. When I asked him one night over bourbon, "Do you think people can really be taught consequences without confrontation?" He leaned back and said, "Only if the consequences are big enough to be unavoidable. Quiet punishment only works if it's felt." That line stuck with me, and it became my mantra for the weeks that followed. My revenge couldn't be loud. It couldn't be an outburst that confirmed their narrative of me being bitter and dramatic. It had to be structural, undeniable, a shifting of the ground beneath them so complete that they'd feel it every day without necessarily knowing when the tremors had started. The plan began to take shape slowly. Emily's wedding had been the pinnacle of my exclusion. But weddings were expensive, and Jason's family had deep but fragile pockets, real estate ventures teetering on loans, a flashy lifestyle propped up by shaky credit. Through Sarah's careless chatter and a few quiet calls to old colleagues in finance, I began to piece together the vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, I stopped sending money home. Quietly, without announcement, The automatic transfers I'd been making to help with my parents' bills simply ceased. A month passed before my mother finally called, her voice dripping with sugar but edged with panic, asking if something went wrong at the bank. I told her calmly, "No, nothing's wrong. I just realized it was time you all stood on your own feet. After all, you've made it clear you don't need me." The silence on the other end of the line was thick, and for the first time in years, I heard uncertainty creep into her voice. That was the first tremor. Still, restraint was everything, so I made sure not to cut them off in a way that seemed vengeful. Instead, I redirected. The scholarship fund got more, Mike's community initiatives got more, even a small local church where I'd once volunteered received a quiet donation in my father's name, though I never told him. The goal wasn't to hoard resources but to realign them, so that my family felt the absence of my support without me appearing petty. And with every step, the notebook grew fatter, pages filled with dates, names, vulnerabilities, patterns. I studied them like a strategist preparing for a campaign because in many ways that's what this was. A campaign of reclamation, fought not with armies or speeches but with silence, precision, and patience. And every night, as I closed the notebook, I touched the old fountain pen Emily had once begged me to buy for her graduation, the one she used to sign her thank you notes to professors, the one she abandoned years ago. It sat on my desk now, a relic of the sacrifices she had forgotten, and I told myself quietly, one day, she'll remember exactly where it came from. Once the silence of my financial absence began to echo through my family's walls, I turned my attention outward, to Emily and Jason, because cutting me out of the wedding had been their opening move, a declaration that they saw me as disposable, and I had no intention of letting that stand. Still, my approach had to remain invisible, so I started with their image, the one thing they prized almost as much as money. Through Sarah's loose tongue, I learned Jason's family was stretching themselves thin, leveraging every bit of borrowed prestige to host not only the wedding, but also a new house in an upscale neighborhood, and appearances were everything to them. I didn't sabotage directly. No, I invested quietly in a local business that Jason's father had been trying to edge out, a small construction firm run by an old acquaintance who'd once been burned by Jason's real estate dealings. With a quiet infusion of capital and a few introductions, that firm suddenly had the leverage to block one of Jason's projects, slowing permits, eating into timelines, and raising whispers in town about his mismanagement. Jason never knew where the resistance was coming from, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Meanwhile, I began hosting quiet dinners with colleagues, deliberately inviting people in finance and real estate circles I knew had tangential dealings with Jason's side of the family, and I let slip small, vague observations, never accusations that they might be overextended, that credit might not be as stable as it looked. In my world, perception often became reality, and within weeks I heard through a colleague that one of Jason's lenders had tightened terms on a deal, citing market caution. That was the second tremor. At the same time, I made sure Emily felt the shift on a more personal level. She had always been the kind of person who thrived on admiration, who lit up when others told her how lucky she was to have a brother like me. But at her wedding, that narrative had been rewritten to paint me as an outsider, someone better left unmentioned. So I reclaimed the story in subtle ways. I began mentoring a few bright students at the university she'd graduated from, kids struggling with the same tuition and pressures she once faced, and when I sponsored one of their projects publicly, I made sure my name was tied to the scholarship that had once quietly covered her tuition. The local alumni magazine ran a piece on it, and though I didn't shove it in her face, I knew Emily saw it because Sarah couldn't resist bringing it up in one of her gossipy updates, masking her discomfort with forced cheer as she told me, "Emily said she's happy you're finally giving back." In the right way, I only smiled and said, "Good, I'm glad she approves." Inside, I knew it burned her to see the very narrative she tried to erase reasserting itself without her permission. Mike noticed the changes in me too, though he never pried. One night he asked, "You sure this isn't just about payback?" And I told him the truth. It's about balance. They tipped the scales, I'm just setting them back. He nodded, and that was enough. Still, his words stayed with me, a quiet reminder that revenge without restraint corrodes the one who wields it. That's why I kept my distance emotionally, always reminding myself this was not about making them hurt as I had hurt, but about ensuring the world they built without me was not as secure as they thought. The most delicate part came when I discovered, again through Sarah's endless stream of details, that Emily and Jason had tied part of their future to a startup investment, a boutique catering company Jason's cousin had launched. They were banking on it being the next trendy hit for weddings and events in the region. Through an old college contact who ran a competing service, I quietly ensured that the cousins' venture faced unexpected hurdles. Permits delayed, suppliers wooed away with better contracts, clients subtly steered elsewhere. I didn't sabotage illegally. I simply gave competitors the resources and introductions they needed to outpace the cousins' firm. Within 6 months, the cousins' business was struggling, and Emily and Jason's smart investment began to look like a liability. Sarah, oblivious to her role as my informant, shared this with me over coffee one afternoon, shaking her head with mock sympathy as she said, "They're just so unlucky. Nothing ever seems to go right for them lately." I stirred my drink, nodded, and offered nothing more than, "That's how the market is." Every move I made was quiet, restrained, untraceable. I wasn't burning bridges. I was simply redirecting the rivers that fed them. And yet I never stopped writing in the notebook, every night before bed, detailing what I had done, what ripple it caused, and what remained to be done. The 3 words at the top of the first page, control, consequence, closure, became less a plan and more a mantra, and I repeated them to myself each time I touched the old fountain pen on my desk. That pen had once symbolized my faith in Emily's future. Now it symbolized the quiet inevitability of consequences she could not outrun. By the time autumn came around, I could feel the pressure closing in on Emily and Jason like a storm tightening its grip on a coastline, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. But I knew the true test of my plan wasn't whether they stumbled. It was whether they looked up and saw nothing but empty space where I used to stand, no hand extended, no safety net waiting to catch them. The final stage required patience, because revenge isn't about loud victories, it's about quiet inevitabilities, and I wanted every thread to tighten at once. I started with their social circle because people like Emily and Jason thrive not on love, not even on respect, but on appearances, the illusion that their world is perfect and admired. So I quietly seeded doubt in those circles, never through direct slander, but through carefully placed questions that I knew would echo louder than any accusation. Over dinner with an old family friend, I mentioned how strange it was that Emily hadn't invited me to her wedding after everything I'd done for her, shaking my head as though I were the one baffled, not bitter. The friend frowned, muttered something about how maybe she was pressured, and though they said no more, I knew the doubt would ripple through the grapevine, staining her image with the quiet question, what kind of sister cuts out her brother like that? At the same time, Jason's business entanglements were already unraveling, and all I had to do was nudge the threads. Through Allow Your Friend, I made sure the local papers picked up on the stalled projects and the faltering catering investment, not as scandals, but as business write-ups about risky moves in a volatile market. To the casual reader, it was nothing. To their peers, it was a sign of weakness, the kind of weakness that makes doors close quietly before you even realize they were open. But I didn't stop there. My family, the same people who had justified my absence at the wedding, became part of the stage without even realizing it. I invited my parents and a few cousins to a small charity gala I sponsored, an event covered in the local magazine with photos and write-ups. I made no grand speeches, offered no bitter remarks about being cut out. I simply smiled for the cameras with them by my side, letting the optics do the work. When the article came out, there I was, David Reynolds, successful, philanthropic, the son and brother anyone would be proud of, standing in sharp contrast to the whispers already circling about Emily and Jason. My parents never mentioned it, but the look on my mother's face the next time we met told me she'd seen the photos, and for the first time I think she questioned the stories she'd told herself about me being the problem. That was enough. Still, the part of me that had once loved my sister couldn't help but hesitate before pulling the final lever. I remembered her graduation night when she hugged me after I gave her that fountain pen and whispered, "I'll never forget what you've done for me." That memory sat heavy in my chest as I sat at my desk one night, notebook open, pen in hand, staring at the last page where I'd written the word closure. Could I really do this, leave her to collapse under the weight of her choices without even warning her? Then I remembered the look she'd given me when she told me I wasn't invited, the cold indifference, the way she turned my sacrifices into something embarrassing, disposable. And in that moment, the hesitation burned away, leaving only clarity. She had chosen her side, now she would live with it. The last move was the simplest. Jason's family had leveraged heavily to keep up appearances, and I knew from Mike's contacts in banking that one more bad quarter would send them scrambling. So I quietly arranged for one of their lenders, a regional bank with a board member I'd known since grad school, to review their exposure more closely. I never asked for action, never suggested a decision. I simply ensured the right eyes saw the right numbers. Within weeks, the line of credit Jason's father depended on was reduced, forcing them to cut back on expenses. Suddenly, the shine of their new house dulled, the parties grew fewer, the circle of admirers thinner, and as all this happened, I said nothing. Not to Emily, not to Sarah, not even to Mike, who suspected, but never pressed. Silence became my sharpest weapon. By winter, the picture was complete. Emily and Jason were struggling quietly, their investments faltering, their reputation shifting from enviable to pitiful, and their family dinners had grown tense with whispers they couldn't control. Meanwhile, my own circle had only grown stronger, my reputation steadier, my presence more visible. I hadn't raised my voice once, hadn't accused or confronted, and yet the balance had shifted entirely. One evening, Sarah called me, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, as she said, "They've been asking about you, you know, wondering why you don't come around. Emily keeps saying she wishes things were different." I let her words hang in the air before I replied softly, "Things are exactly as they chose them to be." She didn't know what to say after that, and for the first time she didn't try to fill the silence. When I closed my notebook that night, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not gloating satisfaction, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you don't need to scream to be heard, that sometimes the quietest moves speak the loudest. I picked up the fountain pen, turned it over in my hand, and thought about how symbols can change meaning. It had once been a gift of hope. Now it was a reminder that hope given freely can be betrayed, but respect, once lost, must be earned back with interest. And Emily, whether she admitted it or not, was learning that lesson every day. The first sign that the collapse had truly begun wasn't something dramatic like a foreclosure notice or a screaming match at a dinner table. It was smaller, quieter, almost pathetic in its ordinariness, the kind of thing most people would overlook if they didn't know the story behind it. I was driving through town on a cold Saturday morning when I saw Emily and Jason's car, well, the car that had once been their pride, the gleaming black SUV they drove to every family gathering as though it were a badge of their new life, parked outside a discount grocery store, not the upscale market they usually flaunted. The car was dusty, the chrome dull, and when they emerged carrying generic brand bags instead of the artisanal goods they used to flaunt, I knew the picture-perfect facade was starting to crack. I didn't honk, didn't stop, didn't let them see me. I simply drove past, filing away the image like a painter adding detail to a portrait of irony. The quiet unraveling only deepened as weeks turned into months. Jason's catering venture had not only stalled but hemorrhaged money, and the family whispers, those same whispers they once used to justify excluding me, now turned against them. Cousins who used to praise Emily's perfect match with Jason began murmuring about poor decisions and living beyond their means. The same aunts and uncles who once told me to understand her position at the wedding now spoke of her with pity rather than admiration, and though no one said it outright, I could feel the tide turning, the weight of silent judgment shifting in my favor without me lifting a finger. But the most telling shift came at home, with our parents. For years, my mother had defended Emily, justifying every slight, every betrayal, smoothing it over with that tone of weary resignation. "She's under a lot of pressure, David. You have to understand." Yet one evening, when I visited her house, sitting at the old kitchen table with the floral tablecloth she refused to replace, she sighed heavily as she poured tea and said something that made me pause mid-sip. "Your sister doesn't call me as much anymore, only when she needs something." She looked at me, not angry, not defensive, just tired, and in her eyes I saw the beginning of recognition. She wasn't asking me to forgive Emily, she was admitting she could no longer ignore the truth. I didn't gloat, didn't push, I simply nodded and said, "People show us who they are when we stop giving them what they want." She didn't reply, but the silence between us said more than any words could. For the first time in years, I felt like she saw me not as the problem, but as the one who had been telling the truth all along. Meanwhile, Emily and Jason clung harder to appearances, desperate to maintain the illusion that nothing was wrong. They hosted a small dinner party at their home in February, inviting family and neighbors, and though I wasn't invited, word traveled fast. The meal was thin, the wine cheap, and the once pristine house showed signs of wear-scuffed walls, a faucet dripping in the background, a rug fraying at the corners. It wasn't like before one cousin confided to me over coffee. They're different now. Tense. I only smiled politely, saying nothing, though inside I recognized the perfection of it. Their need to control the narrative was unraveling faster than they could patch it, and all I had to do was remain silent, my absence speaking louder than any presence ever could. Jason's business debts eventually reached a tipping point. One of his major backers pulled out after the bank cut their credit line, and within weeks, whispers of bankruptcy circled the community. Emily tried to hide the panic, posting carefully curated photos online, pretending their lives remained untouched, but even that mask began to slip. Her posts grew fewer, her captions shorter, her once boastful tone replaced with vague platitudes about staying strong and valuing what really matters. To the casual observer, it was just social media fluff. To me, it was the language of someone cornered, someone who had built her house of cards too high, and now had no way to stop the wind. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very family who once cheered her decision to cut me out of her wedding now began asking me, in hushed tones, if I knew how Emily was really doing. At first, I shrugged and said little, but eventually, I let a hint of honesty slip. She hasn't asked for my help, I said softly, and after everything, I think it's best if she figures it out on her own. The weight of those words wasn't lost on them. It was a reminder that she had made her choices, and I wasn't going to swoop in to fix them. For once, no one told me to be more understanding. No one chastised me for being distant. They simply nodded, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge what they now saw too clearly. And yet, through all this, I didn't feel the giddy triumph I once thought I would. Watching Emily and Jason stumble wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about balance, the restoration of truth in a family that had chosen lies for too long. There were moments when I almost pitied her, when I thought about that fountain pen I'd given her at graduation, when I remembered her arms around me and her promise never to forget what I'd done. But then I remembered the wedding, the way she had looked at me with that cold detachment, as if I were an embarrassment to be hidden away, and the pity dissolved. Choices have consequences, and for the first time she was living with hers. The final touch of this chapter came not from me, but from the community. At a spring charity event, another I had quietly sponsored, Jason and Emily showed up, desperate to be seen, desperate to prove they still belonged. But while I stood in the center of the room speaking with local leaders, shaking hands, their presence went largely unnoticed. People nodded politely, then turned away, their attention drawn elsewhere. They were no longer the shining couple at the center of admiration. They were fading, ghosts clinging to a spotlight that no longer wanted them. I didn't need to say a word. My silence, my distance, and my steadiness had done what anger never could. And as I left that evening, slipping the fountain pen back into my jacket pocket after signing a donation pledge, I realized that the final act wasn't about humiliating them. It was about ensuring they understood, deep in their bones, that they had cut out the one person who had stood by them and now they stood alone. It was almost inevitable that the silence between us would not last forever, though when Emily finally broke it, it came not with an apology or a confession, but with a fragile, stumbling attempt at small talk, as though we could simply erase the years of betrayal and pretend we were just siblings who drifted apart. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with her name, a name I hadn't seen flash across the screen in months, maybe longer, and for a moment I simply stared at it, the vibration rattling against the wood of my desk. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her words disappear into voicemail limbo, but curiosity won, and I answered with the measured calm I'd mastered. "David," she said, her voice thinner than I remembered, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who hasn't been sleeping. "Hey, how are you?" The question landed awkwardly, like a stranger rehearsing a script, and I almost laughed at the irony of it. How was I? Fine, steady, living the life I'd built while she had tried to erase me from hers. I gave her the most neutral reply I could. "I'm doing well, busy as always." A silence stretched, and then she filled it with nervous chatter, telling me about the weather, about how our mother had been feeling, about nothing of substance at all, circling like someone afraid to touch the real wound. When she finally hung up, thanking me for just talking, I set the phone down and leaned back, realizing that beneath her careful words was an unspoken truth. Things were worse than she wanted to admit, and this was her way of testing the waters. Over the next weeks, her attempts became more frequent, each one a little more transparent. First, another call with the same nervous tone, then a text asking if I remembered a restaurant we used to love as kids. then a hesitant suggestion that we catch up sometime. But with every attempt, I noticed a pattern. She never said the words that mattered, never acknowledged the wedding, never once admitted that she had wronged me in the most public, humiliating way possible. It was as if she thought that by layering enough nostalgia and small kindnesses, she could patch over the gaping hole she had carved into our relationship. What she didn't realize was that her avoidance was the clearest confession of all, that she knew what she had done was unforgivable, and she was too ashamed to name it aloud. And so I responded sparingly, politely, but without warmth. Glad to hear you're doing okay. Yes, I remember that place. Maybe sometime, but work is busy. Each reply was measured, designed to keep the door cracked without ever inviting her back inside. The silence between my words said everything I needed it to. I was not rushing to rescue her, not falling into old patterns of sacrifice. I was no longer the brother who saved her. I was the man who had learned to let her drown in the waters she chose. The shift became visible to others as well. Our mother, who had once urged me to be patient, now confided in me during one of our weekly dinners, her voice carrying a mix of worry and resignation. She called me yesterday, asking if I could lend her money for rent. Can you believe that? There was no malice in her tone, just sadness, as though she was watching one child unravel while realizing too late how much she had taken from the other. I only stirred my coffee, letting the silence linger before I finally said, "We all make choices, Mom. She's living with hers." My mother didn't argue this time, didn't plead Emily's case as she once would have. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with a recognition that perhaps she had enabled the wrong child for far too long. Jason, too, began to fade from the picture. Rumors spread that he had taken on a string of odd jobs after the catering business collapsed, and more than once I heard from acquaintances that they'd spotted him tending bar or hauling equipment for events where, years earlier, he'd been the guest of honor. Emily's curated life on social media had all but vanished, replaced by silence or the occasional recycled photo from better days. Their world was shrinking, and though she tried to clutch at fragments of connection, the truth was clear. She was standing at the edges now, looking in, while I remained steady at the center of the life I had built without her. The most poignant moment came one rainy evening in March, when I stopped by our parents' house to drop off groceries for my mother. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a familiar figure standing on the porch, her hair plastered to her face by the drizzle, her posture slumped in a way I had never seen. Emily. She turned when she heard my car door shut, and for a moment, our eyes locked. She looked smaller somehow, not the triumphant bride who had once declared I wasn't welcome, but a woman cracked open by her own decisions. "David," she said softly, almost pleadingly, as though my name itself might serve as a lifeline. I didn't respond immediately. I walked past her, up the steps, and only when I reached the door did I pause. "You should go inside," I said flatly, holding the door open for her but not inviting her in with warmth. She hesitated, searching my face for something, mercy, forgiveness, familiarity, but I gave her nothing. She stepped inside, dripping water onto the rug, and I handed the grocery bags to our mother before retreating to the living room. From the kitchen, I could hear their hushed voices, Emily's breaking with quiet sobs, my mother's carrying the soft tones of comfort. I sat in silence, staring at the pen I had pulled from my pocket, rolling it between my fingers, reminding myself that silence was my power now. When Emily finally emerged, her eyes red, she glanced at me as if hoping for one last chance at connection. "Maybe we could talk, just you and me?" she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment, then shook my head slowly. "Not today." Her shoulders sagged, and she left without another word. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. She was beginning to feel the weight of the life she had built without me, the cost of cutting me out in her moment of pride. And though part of me longed for the sibling I had once loved, I knew that what she was seeking now was not reconciliation, but rescue. She wanted me to step in, as I always had, to shoulder the burden she and Jason could no longer carry. But the silence I gave her was not cruelty, it was justice. It was the echo of every moment she had left me standing on the outside, watching a celebration I had paid for but was not allowed to join. Now she was the one on the outside, pressing her face to the glass, realizing too late that the door would not open for her again. The final unraveling came more quietly than I might have imagined, less like an explosion and more like the slow collapse of a house whose foundations had long since rotted. Months had passed since Emily's hesitant attempts to reach me, months of strained calls and awkward silences where she tried to dance around the truth, hoping nostalgia could bridge the chasm she had carved. But life has a way of forcing honesty, and in the end, it wasn't her words but her circumstances that exposed the truth. Jason's debts, once whispered rumors, became unavoidable fact when creditors began hounding our parents, calling their landline at odd hours, demanding payment for loans Jason had taken in their names. My mother, red-eyed and trembling, showed me the letters one evening, her hands shaking as she slid them across the table. "We didn't know, David. We thought he was managing. He said it was just temporary." I read the numbers, the legal threats, the bold black print screaming overdue, and I felt a grim calm settle in my chest. The same man they had welcomed in place of me had not only squandered his own life but had dragged theirs down with him, and my sister, who had stood at his side, proud and defiant, was now entangled in the wreckage. My father, who had once muttered about me being too independent, too distant, now stared at the floor, shame etched into his features as he realized that the son he had quietly minimized was the only one still standing steady. It was around this time that Emily showed up at my office, unannounced, a sight so jarring that my assistant nearly dropped the folders she was carrying. Dressed in clothes that looked worn, her makeup barely concealing the exhaustion on her face, Emily waited for me in the lobby until I emerged, her eyes wide and almost childlike in their desperation. "David, please, I just need a few minutes," she said, her voice breaking. I considered ignoring her, walking past, but something in me, curiosity maybe or the need for closure, tilted the balance, and I gestured for her to follow me into the conference room. She sat across from me, wringing her hands, and for the first time she said the words she had avoided for so long. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have done what I did. I shouldn't have cut you out. I don't know what I was thinking, but I need your help now." The admission hung in the air, heavy, too late. I studied her. This woman who had once been my little sister, whom I had carried on my back as a child, whose tuition checks I had written without hesitation, whose mistakes I had shielded her from again and again. Now she sat before me, stripped of pride, her voice quivering, her eyes begging for the lifeline she had once so arrogantly discarded. For a long moment, I said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice calm but cold. "You didn't just cut me out, Emily. You erased me. You stood there and let everyone believe I didn't matter. And now, when the walls are crumbling, you come to me. Why? Because you know I'll fix it, the way I always have?" She tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "I'm not your safety net anymore. I won't save you from the life you chose." Her face crumpled, and she reached across the table as if touch could undo words. But I stood, pushing my chair back with deliberate slowness. "You wanted a life without me, Emily. Now you have it." With that, I walked out, leaving her in the sterile conference room, her sobs muffled by the thick glass walls. My assistant glanced at me as I passed, her expression unreadable, but I could see in her eyes the recognition of a truth she would never voice aloud. This was not cruelty, it was justice. The ripple effect of my refusal became clear in the weeks that followed. Jason disappeared from the picture, swallowed by debt and disgrace, while Emily, stripped of her curated social circle, returned to our parents' home, her pride reduced to ashes. Where once she had been the center of attention, hosting parties and posting glossy snapshots of a life she believed untouchable, now she was a shadow moving through familiar hallways, her head bowed, her voice small. Neighbors who had once praised her wedding whispered about the irony of her fall, while friends who had flocked to her in better days vanished without explanation. It was in this hollowed-out space that my parents began to see the truth with brutal clarity. The child they had defended, justified, and prioritized had abandoned them in their time of need, while the son they had overlooked was the only one still present, steady, dependable. My mother said it one night, her voice breaking as she set down her fork at dinner. "We were wrong, David. We should have seen it sooner." My father, silent, simply nodded, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked like both regret and respect. And so the balance shifted, not with a dramatic showdown, but with a quiet, undeniable realignment of truth. Emily's calls dwindled, then stopped, not because she had found a solution, but because she had finally realized none was coming from me. The silence between us, once a weapon, became the final verdict. I had given her every chance to acknowledge, to repair, and when she did, it was too late, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because the life she had chosen was the consequence she had earned. Justice, I realized, was not about revenge or spectacle. It was about letting the truth stand unshaken. Years from now, people may forget the details of her wedding, the guests, the flowers, the laughter I was never allowed to hear. But they will remember what came after. The steady collapse of a house built on pride, the slow unraveling of choices made in arrogance, the silence of a brother who no longer answered the call. And if Emily ever tells the story of her life, she may try to paint herself as misunderstood, unlucky, even victimized. But deep down, she will know, just as I do, that the moment she cut me out of her wedding was the moment she severed the cord that had held her above water all those years. Without it, she sank, not because I pushed her, but because she refused the hand that once would have pulled her back to shore. And me? I didn't sink with her. I walked away, steady, silent, carrying with me the one thing she could never take, the dignity of knowing I had always been there, until she chose to believe I wasn't. That was my justice. Not loud, not vengeful, but absolute. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.